He was only 6 when the Iron Curtain separated him from his parents, leaving him home in Romania when they were visiting the United States. After years of forced child labor and communist indoctrination, a congresswoman from Ohio learned of his case and took it to President Eisenhower, who secured his release in a spy swap, bringing him to the United States as a young celebrity who didn't know a word of English. Peter Georgescu learned English and went on to Princeton and Stanford Business School, moving to the world of Madison Avenue in the days of Mad Men. He started as a researcher at Young and Rubicam and rose to become chairman and CEO of the advertising giant. Now Georgescu has a new mission. Having seen the worst socialism has to offer and what capitalism at its best can mean for those in need, he's urging corporations to return to pursuing the best for all their stakeholders: shareholders, workers, customers, and society at large. On today's Big Decisions, Peter Georgescu. Peter Georgescu, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions. Great to have you here. There's a lot of talk about socialism these days. It strikes me you have a personal experience with socialism going way back into your childhood. Tell us about it.
Well, socialism. I was prepared for socialism by being born in just as the Second World War started. And I arrived in 1939 just as the war got to be big and real at the time. I was born from Romanian parents, both of them. One educated in London. My father became a petroleum engineer, came to Romania, became general manager of the largest oil field in Romania, which is owned by Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon. So as the Germans came in, the Romanian sympathizing Nazi regime put him in jail. My father worked for the OSS. From prison, my mother became a courier with the OSS. He faced a firing squad. They thought they had him, but he received a last-minute reprieve. Anyway, we all survived the war. We got together in '45. I was 6 years old. My brother, my aunt, myself, my parents. Normal, wonderful family life. I learned how to ride a bike from my father in the day. A year and a half of joy and happiness. And then in early '47, my father goes to New York, and for what was to be a 2-week sort of major worldwide managers meeting of Exxon. And they go, but just at that time, the Russians create a coup across the entire Eastern Europe, including Romania, and now the communists took over.
The Iron Curtain essentially fell.
The Iron Curtain comes down at that moment, and it is an Iron Curtain, as we know, because that's how socialism works. Total control. While in New York, my father's friends from war days, who started the CIA by now, tells them, in Romania, the communists have my father and mother on a list to be arrested and exterminated. So they convinced them to stay in New York, lucky for all of us. Because in fact, during that period, in early communist takeover Romania, they gathered some 300,000 business leaders, religious leaders. Anybody who was a potential threat or perceived to be a potential threat was rounded up. Within 2 years, they're all dead. My grandfather was one of them. They arrested him, almost 80 years of age, put him in prison, and murdered him there. Shortly after they arrested him, they took my brother, myself, and my grandmother to a small town close to the Russian border. The guise was, when they took us over, they said, "You're going to meet your parents. We're taking you to New York." They took us, my grandmother, in house arrest. So she stayed there, couldn't move out, and didn't for about 4 years. 5 years, close to 5 years. And then my brother and I were taken to work at 6 o'clock in the morning. We worked until about 6 o'clock at night.
So how old were you at that point?
I was just north of 10. I can't remember the exact time and date, but I was about 10 or so.
But thinking back on it, why did they do this? Why were you a threat to the communist regime in Romania?
It's interesting you asked the question. It was reprisal. Reprisal against my parents. Because in addition to work, we also went to every 6 weeks or so to interrogation sessions, where they're brainwashing sessions. And really, all it was to tell us just how awful our parents were. They're evil people. They were unpatriotic against Romania. They were trying to harm the country. They're just indecent people, harmful to the nation and to the world.
Did they make any inroads with you psychologically at that point?
Well, that's what they were trying to say. They left you behind. They're awful people, right? The irony of saying they're awful people, but you have to suffer here. And my job was the first 2 years to clean sewers because I was small enough to fit in the underground passages. And then I worked digging holes for electric poles and worked on the high tension wires. But the irony of that didn't seem to turn into reality for them. So we did that 6 days a week, you see. And on Sundays you slept, because that's all there was to do to be able to survive.
How did you come to the United States, given that situation?
There was no way out. But in New York, fate worked in a totally different way. So what happened in New York is that the Soviets and the Russians particularly sent a Romanian diplomat to tell my father, if you want to see your kids alive again, you're going to spy for us. So my father and mother spent a sleepless night. That morning, my father went to the FBI and told them the story. They said, please become a double agent. Dad said, I've seen that play before, it never works well. Eventually, I can't do something or I don't want to do something, they'll kill the kids anyway. Eventually, they agreed, go to the press with this story.
They went to the press.
They went to the press. And they were afraid. The FBI was afraid that maybe the story wouldn't take off. Every little town in America, you'll find, in 1953, there's a story of the Georgescu boys and the family being blackmailed with the life of the kids. One of the people who read the story was a woman. She was an amazing woman. She was a congresswoman, not from New York, my father lived, from Ohio. She picks up the phone and says, Mr. Georgescu, I'll get your boys out of Romania. I am Frances Payne Bolton. I'm a congresswoman from Ohio. She also happened to be not only the only congresswoman, I believe at that time, in Congress, but also the chairperson of the Foreign Relations Committee in Congress. So you can imagine in 1953 what she must have been like. Yeah. She was a force of nature. And so it took her a year. She ended up in Eisenhower's office and said, Mr. President, and by the way, she helped him become president. So she had some chits with Ike. Mr. President, we've got to get the boys out of Romania. So they concocted a plan, some people, including the CIA, to trade us for a bunch of Russian spies. So on April 13th, a date I remember, I landed with my father at Idlewild Airport with my brother. I was 15 years old. I was kind of skinny, but fully grown. I was a young man by then, for sure. I didn't speak a word of English other than Coca-Cola, and I hadn't gone to school since 5th grade.
But you were famous.
But I was, my goodness, at Idlewild Airport, now Kennedy, there were probably 200 reporters and flashing lights, and it was a circus. It was an unbelievable circus as we got off the plane. So, and in fact, we went to every show that you can imagine. We were on Ed Sullivan's show, and Good Morning America, and you name it.
You didn't speak English when you came here in '53, and you ended up at Exeter. How did you get from there to Exeter?
Well, we arrived in April, as I said. So the principal of Exeter reads the story. So calls up Dad, he said, I'll keep a place for the young boy. My dad said, but sir, you remember, he doesn't speak English. He hadn't gone to school for 4 years. He said, oh, I know, I read the story, but he learned other things there. Help him learn English, then come in August to Exeter, let's have dinner, and we'll go from there. So I work hard to learn English. I watch a lot of I Love Lucy's. I try to imitate Ricardo's accent, which was not difficult at the time. And we ended up for dinner with the principal, William Gurdon Saltonstall. He likes me. I don't remember the chit-chat of the conversation, but whatever it was, he likes me. I remember the punchline. At the end of the dinner, he said, young man, if you can pass your courses on your own, with no consideration for your background, you get to stay. Otherwise, I'll find the right school for you. Is that okay? I had no clue what he was talking about. I thought a school was a school. But I was smart enough to say, yes, sir. So now I'm at Exeter. And I did pass the courses, barely, but I did. But in 3 years, I was able to get into Princeton.
You went to Princeton and then Stanford.
I went to Stanford Business School, yes.
As well. I mean, how jarring must it have been to go from that existence in Romania over the course of a very few years to now you have a Stanford MBA? How jarring was it? What did it tell you about this country?
Well, I tell you, it started, the sense of gratitude began to emerge in my mind. Gratitude. I love that word because so many people did so many wonderful things. Why did Frances Bolton, Congresswoman from Ohio, reach out to my father? Why did the principal of Exeter say, I'll keep a place for you? It made no sense. They did it because they could. They did it because they cared, and they reached out. There was a culture of reaching out to people, to help each other. There was a lot of good things were happening around that time, and I was the beneficiary. Today I can look in the mirror, and I know I am the best Peter Georgescu that I can be, ever. And only in America can you do that.
Why advertising?
You have to understand people, care for people. I was intrigued by that.
Why advertising?
I was destined to be in the oil business. In fact, before I went to Stanford, Exxon International, because they knew me and they knew my father, said, you got a job. Just graduated from business school, you got a job. By accident, I was in the placement director's office as a friend because I already had a job. He says, you're going to go interview this guy. I said, oh, really? Why would I do that? Because only one person signed up, and we need him to come back to Stanford to keep interviewing. So you're going to be very interesting. I said, okay, I'll do that for you. You're a good friend. What business are you in? Advertising. I said, perfect. I know nothing about it. So anyway, I interviewed with this guy, and he convinced me. He told me that you have to start in research, and he described what research meant. You have to understand people, care for people, and size them up and make sure that whatever the clients or the producer offer this customer, it makes sense to them, and take people very seriously. I was intrigued by that.
And you climbed up through the ranks, ultimately becoming chairman and CEO. But most of what we know right now about Madison Avenue in the 60s comes from Mad Men. Is it accurate?
Well, it is interesting. Mad Men, only to this degree. I met my wife, who was the head of a little portion of the research department. She was a year younger than I, but she went directly to work and ended up at Young Rubicam in research. So that's where we met. So I married my boss. I thought, I'm an immigrant guy. Marrying a boss, that's a good thing. So that's how my world really started.
What was it about advertising that you came to love? You must have loved it to have done as well as you did.
The research. The lucky start for me was getting to the research business. I understood that the entire business world revolves around a customer. There's always a customer somewhere. And I learned to respect the people. I learned to respect the average citizen, who is the average customer or American business.
Advertising grew, and Young and Rubicam grew when you were there, but also under your leadership. Acquisitions, you ultimately went public. Things like that. What was that like?
Interestingly, Young and Rubicam, the advertising company, was, as you mentioned, it was in a sweet spot. The advertising people were really the partners to our clients. We created all kinds of tools. We created the only, still today, when I was CEO, we began to put together the only really enduring study of what a brand is and how you keep a brand strong and so forth. And we created like small agencies around the client. It was Team Ford, Team Colgate, Team Kodak. So we went to a client, they never knew who was in the room. But we provided them with an integrated marketing communication program. But then we had to go public because in the 90s, all the agencies were part of conglomerates and holding companies. We were the only private company. And it was clear to me that I couldn't make any acquisitions, and we needed to bolster our international presence. I left in 2000. I was 60 years old, and I sold my stock and disappeared. But 2 years later, what happened to the business was tragic. In the dot-com bust, if you will, they had to protect their multiples. And so they fired a whole ton of people. In fact, they fired all the intellectual capital that provided the opportunity for people like me to go to the corner office and become my clients' best partners.
Given the way things have gone with algorithms, was it inevitable that you could not invest in the intellectual capital that gave you, for example, your brand stake?
No, I don't think it was inevitable at all. It's not what happens to you that defines who you are, it's how you respond that matters. And we responded badly. We should have protected the business. We had a unique advantage. We had a differentiation. After I left, they broke all of that apart because it was easier to control financially silos than it was an integrated company, which is much more complicated, difficult to run.
It sounds though like the large advertising of today are going to have a tough time attracting the Peter Georgescu's. It's the Stanford Business School around the corner.
When I was there, young Rubicam hired 5 to 7 MBAs every year. I bet you can hunt the halls of Madison Avenue. You're unlikely to find MBAs, any MBAs.
And yet in this digital world, brand is arguably more important than ever to try to sort through the multiplicity of outlets. Who's doing that work?
Well, again, the advertising and PR companies, direct marketing companies are a part of it, but they are the executioner of the communication strategies that are being developed by somebody else. So it's the combination today, it's the combination of the clients working together with the consulting companies, the Bains, the McKinseys, the BCGs, and so forth.
You're concerned about capitalism. Why?
We have a crisis. We have great inequality.
You've had, in many ways, a remarkable life, but one particular way is you've seen, I can say, the extremes of socialism and very, very successful capitalism, the full gamut. You're the author of a book, Capitalists Arise, ! You're concerned about capitalism. Why?
For America, it built the largest economic market in the world, which was America's middle class. For the world, the principles of free enterprise capitalism really lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty to a much more humane standard of living. All you have to do is think about China and India, throughout Latin America, Europe, and so forth. So it works. The question for capitalism is an issue of the choice of governance. And what I mean by governance, what do you want capitalism to do? For the first 40 years, capitalism was asked to serve not only the shareholder, but the workers and society as well. And society also gave corporations advantages like limited liability and also much preferential treatments on taxation versus the ordinary income. And that compact ended in the mid-'80s. And in the mid-'80s, there's a new governance which says the shareholder now becomes prime. So it was about maximizing short-term shareholder value. And when you maximize something, it's a zero-sum game. The winners, everybody else is a loser. And in this case, the everybody else were the workers and society. So now we have a crisis. We have great inequality. For 40 years, business makes sure that the workers, the employees, had flat salaries or compensation. For 40 years. It's a tragedy. And that affected what happened in the communities. The education, which is paid by real estate taxes, became horrible. And this is not sustainable. Close to 60% of American homes have to borrow money to put food on the table. So we have to change. And there's a little bit of hope coming here because we see that business recognizes this issue. And the Business Roundtable, the most prestigious organization of capitalism, just 2 months ago, said society has got to be taken into consideration. I've worked with the Business Roundtable as an outside consultant, and I was thrilled at the courageous thing that they did.
You referred to the Business Roundtable with their new statement of principles as courageous. Certainly some companies, Jamie Dimon's talked about this, other people have talked about that, Alex Gorski, Johnson & Johnson. But is it broadly accepted in the C-suite enough so that it will actually change?
Well, I think that Jamie Dimon and Alex Gorski, as I mentioned, deserve enormous credit, the two of them leaders. And 170 out of the 187 or so folks who, corporations that belong to the Business Roundtable signed up for this. So this is a really serious endorsement of a different version of capitalism. But that's just the beginning of principles. Now other institutions must come in. And one of them, for example, is Just Capital. And I'm a director of Just Capital. And we do many things, but importantly, we measure the justness of corporations. And we are creating, in fact, specific areas of what it means to stakeholder capitalism. Example, on workers. What do? Well, you have to pay more. I don't mean wealth transfer. I mean pay people out of the incremental value of what they produce. Have them share in the value of what they produce. Turn them from a cost, which shareholder primacy says people are a cost, to say people, employees, are the value creators of the 21st century.
Can we have the broad systemic change that you're talking about without the government?
Government can help a great deal. But what I've learned from Romania, and I watched them very carefully for a long time, is government cannot manage capitalism. The government cannot legislate justness. Capitalism must adopt justness and fairness, and it must produce the great work and the great results. Capitalists can do that. We need capitalism. We're not going to compete with China by having the government run businesses. We're going to die.
Do we have the time to allow the sorts of changes that you're describing? Because you and I both know we're losing a good part of a generation of young people right now who are coming from broken homes and do not have a good education, are not prepared for the 21st century.
Let's solve the problem. Let's change the governance and say, we demand inclusive growth. The Founding Fathers created this vision that said basically, all people are created equal, and they said, and all these people have an inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness. In contemporary terms, what that means is basically each person has one vote, right? And that we have equality, not of income, equality of opportunity. We need to think of our problems as America's problems. All of our kids are our kids. We must look after all of them. And that's why inclusive prosperity makes sense. If we want democracy, we have to act as a democracy. So it's up to us as people to do that. We capitalists must commit to doing the right thing, to have the right governance. So myself and lots of other good people are working to say stakeholder capitalism must win, must capture all of us business, and must capture the imagination of all of our people, and must partner with government to make sure that the guardrails are in place. We must hold business accountable for their actions.
Peter Georgescu, thank you so much. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.